Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where we unpack the stories that shaped our world. Tonight we're exploring Israel, a land roughly the size of New Jersey, that has somehow managed to be the centre of more historical drama than a Shakespeare festival. From ancient Jerusalem's golden stones to the modern tech hubs of Tel Aviv, this small strip of Mediterranean coastline has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of religions, and conflicts that have echoed across millennia. We'll journey through 4,000 years of history, from Canaanite cities to Roman legions, from Crusader castles to Ottoman rule, and into the complex realities of the modern Middle East. It's a story of conquest and survival, of faith and politics, of a land that refuses to be anything but extraordinary. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're listening from tonight. This community spans the globe and it's always amazing to see. And if you want more deep dives into the world's most fascinating places, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. So grab your favourite blanket, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let's explore the remarkable history of Israel. Chapter 1: Ancient Foundations. Picture this. You're standing in the ancient land of Canaan, sometime around 2000 BCE, and you're watching what might be history's first example of a neighbourhood that just can't catch a break. This sliver of land, nestled between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, was destined to become the crossroads of civilizations, the meeting point of empires, and quite possibly the world's longest-running example of prime real estate that everyone wants to claim. The geography here tells a story all by itself. Israel sits at the junction of three continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. It's like nature decided to put a welcome to the neighbourhood sign right where all the major trade routes would eventually meet. The land stretches from the snowy peaks of Mount Hermon in the north, where you can actually ski if you're feeling adventurous, all the way down to the sun-baked shores of the Red Sea in the south. And yes, before you ask, this is the same Red Sea that supposedly parted for Moses, though we'll get to that particular tale a bit later. The earliest inhabitants we know about were the Canaanites, a collection of various tribes who had the misfortune of living in what would become history's most contested parking spot. These folks were actually quite sophisticated for their time, developing city-states like Jericho, which, fun fact, is often cited as one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. Imagine the property values there. Charming stone dwelling. Only 4,000 years old, walls may or may not fall down at the sound of trumpets. Around 1900 BCE, according to biblical accounts, a man named Abraham received what might be history's first divine real estate offer. God allegedly told him to pack up his camels and head to this promised land, where his descendants would become as numerous as the stars. Abraham, being either very faithful or perhaps just tired of the weather in Mesopotamia, made the journey. His descendants would become known as the Israelites, though it would take them a few centuries and a rather eventful detour through Egypt to actually settle down properly. The story of the Israelites' time in Egypt and subsequent exodus is one of those historical narratives that sits somewhere between archaeology and faith. According to tradition, they spent 400 years in Egypt, eventually becoming enslaved, until Moses led them out in an event involving 10 plagues, a parted sea, and what must have been the world's longest camping trip through the Sinai desert. Archaeologists have found limited direct evidence for these events, but the story became foundational to Jewish identity and, later, to Christianity and Islam as well. What we do know is that by around 1200 BCE, the Israelites had established themselves in the land of Canaan. They organized into 12 tribes, each named after one of Jacob's sons. Jacob being Abraham's grandson who wrestled with an angel and got his name changed to Israel, which roughly translates to he who wrestles with God. Apparently, even divine customer service representatives had their difficult days. The early Israelite period was marked by what historians call the time of the judges, a rather chaotic era when leadership was provided by various military leaders and prophets who rose to meet specific crises. It was like having a government that only functioned during emergencies, which, considering the neighborhood, meant it functioned almost constantly. Famous figures from this period include Samson, whose hair-based superpowers would make even modern fitness influencers jealous, and Deborah, a female judge and prophet who proved that effective leadership has never been limited by gender. Around 1000 BCE, the Israelites decided they needed a king, partly because all the cool neighbouring nations had them, and partly because the judge system was proving about as reliable as a weather forecast. They got Saul, who started well but ended poorly, followed by David, a shepherd boy turned warrior king whose resume included giant slaying and psalm writing. David established Jerusalem as his capital, choosing a hilltop city that belonged to the Jebusites and was considered virtually impregnable. The Jebusites were presumably less than thrilled about this development. David's son Solomon took the throne around 970 BCE and proceeded to build what might have been the ancient world's most impressive construction project, the first temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't just any temple, this was a building designed to house the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid with gold and featuring architectural details that would make modern luxury hotels weep with envy. Solomon also built palaces, fortifications, and established trade relationships that brought wealth flowing into Israel like water through the Jordan River. Unfortunately, Solomon's building projects came with a price tag that would make modern national debt look reasonable. Heavy taxation and forced labour created resentment that bubbled up after his death. The kingdom split in two, Israel in the north with 10 tribes and a capital at Samaria, and Judah in the south with 2 tribes and Jerusalem as its capital. This division would prove to be about as effective as a chocolate teapot when the great empires came knocking. The Assyrian Empire, which had been expanding westward like a particularly aggressive real estate company, conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. The 10 northern tribes were scattered and eventually became known as the Lost Tribes of Israel, though they were probably less lost and more forcibly relocated to various parts of the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom of Judah managed to hold on a bit longer, paying tribute and generally trying to stay off Assyria's radar. But empires have a way of changing hands, and the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II eventually conquered the Assyrians and turned their attention to the remaining Hebrew kingdom. In 586 BCE, after several rebellions and sieges, Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and Solomon's temple, carrying off much of the population to Babylon in what became known as the Babylonian exile. It was history's first major example of urban renewal gone terribly wrong. The exile lasted about 70 years, during which time the Jewish people developed new ways of maintaining their identity without a temple or homeland. They created what we might call history's first successful diaspora community, maintaining their traditions, laws, and hopes for return while living under foreign rule. It was like maintaining your local sports team loyalty while living in a rival city. Difficult but not impossible with enough determination. In 538 BCE, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and immediately implemented what might have been the ancient world's first humanitarian foreign policy. Cyrus issued a decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. For the Jews, this was like winning the ancient equivalent of the lottery. They began returning to Jerusalem and, under leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, rebuilt the temple and the city walls. This Second Temple period marked a crucial phase in Jewish development. The returning exiles found that some Jews had remained in the land during the exile, and there were also various foreign peoples who had settled there. Integrating these communities while maintaining religious purity became a central challenge. The Torah, or Jewish law, was codified during this period, creating a written foundation for Jewish life that would survive even without a temple or homeland. Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BCE like a Mediterranean hurricane, conquering everything from Greece to India in just over a decade. His visit to Jerusalem was reportedly peaceful. Legend says the Jewish high priest showed him prophecies from the book of Daniel that seemed to predict his conquests, which apparently impressed Alexander enough to leave the city alone. Whether this actually happened or whether it's just ancient public relations is anyone's guess, but it makes for a better story than Alexander was too busy to bother with one more hilltop city. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals, and Israel found itself caught between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. For about a century, the Ptolemies controlled the region, and Jewish life continued relatively peacefully. But in 198 BCE, the Seleucids took control, and things began to get complicated again. The real crisis came under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid ruler whose name meant God made manifest, but whose policies suggested he might have been more chaos made manifest. In 167 BCE, he prohibited Jewish religious practices, desecrated the temple by sacrificing pigs on the altar, and generally behaved like someone who had never heard of cultural sensitivity training. This triggered the Maccabean revolt, led by a Jewish priest named Mattathias and his sons. The most famous son was Judah, nicknamed Maccabee, meaning the hammer, which gives you some idea of his negotiating style. Against all odds, this guerrilla warfare campaign succeeded in driving out the Seleucids and establishing an independent Jewish state called the Hasmonean Kingdom. The victory is celebrated today as Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, commemorating the rededication of the temple. According to tradition, when they cleaned up the desecrated temple, they found only enough consecrated oil to burn the eternal flame for one day, but miraculously, it lasted for 8 days. Whether you view this as divine intervention or excellent ancient oil conservation, it certainly makes for a more inspiring holiday than "we successfully completed building maintenance week." The Hasmonean Kingdom lasted for about a century, during which time it expanded to control much of the territory once held by David and Solomon. However, like many successful revolution leaders, the Hasmoneans proved better at winning independence than at governing peacefully. Internal conflicts and power struggles weakened the kingdom just as a new superpower was rising in the west. Rome had been expanding eastward, and by 63 BCE, General Pompey arrived in Jerusalem to sort out a civil war between two Hasmonean brothers. Romans were generally practical about these things. They supported whoever seemed most likely to maintain order and pay taxes. Unfortunately for Jewish independence, this marked the beginning of Roman control over the land of Israel, a relationship that would prove about as harmonious as a cat in a dog park. The Roman period began what historians sometimes call the Second Temple period's final chapter. The Romans initially governed through client kings, the most famous being Herod the Great, who ruled from 37 to 4 BCE. Herod was an Edomite by birth, which made him about as popular with religious Jews as a bacon vendor at a synagogue, but he was also a master builder whose architectural projects rivaled anything in the Roman Empire. Herod's most ambitious project was the expansion of the Second Temple, transforming it into one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Temple Mount was expanded to accommodate hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. The temple itself was rebuilt with white stone and gold overlay that was so brilliant in sunlight that visitors had to shield their eyes. It was ancient Jerusalem's version of Las Vegas, minus the slot machines but with significantly more religious significance. The religious landscape during this period was remarkably diverse. The Sadducees collaborated with Roman authorities and controlled the temple. The Pharisees focused on religious scholarship, developing interpretations that would later form rabbinical Judaism. The Essenes withdrew to desert communities like Qumran, producing the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Zealots believed armed resistance against Rome was religiously mandated. Into this environment came a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth around 30 CE. His crucifixion by Pontius Pilate was intended to end a potentially disruptive movement, but instead launched Christianity. Tensions between Jews and Romans escalated through the 1st century CE. In 66 CE, protests escalated into the First Jewish-Roman War, also called the Great Revolt. Jewish forces initially achieved remarkable success, capturing Jerusalem and establishing independence. However, the Romans under Vespasian and his son Titus systematically recaptured territory. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked the tragic climax. After months of starvation, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, and much of the city's population faced death or slavery. Thus ended the ancient foundations period, with the land having witnessed Canaanites, Israelites, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Each culture left its mark on this strategically crucial territory. The temple's destruction would force a diaspora lasting nearly 2,000 years, transforming Judaism from a temple-centered religion to one of the book. Chapter 2. Medieval Crossroads. If Chapter 1 ended with Jerusalem in flames and the Second Temple reduced to rubble, Chapter 2 opens with the remarkable resurrection of this ancient city as the spiritual center of not just one, but 3 major world religions. Welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're exploring how a patch of land, smaller than most American counties, became the ultimate real estate triple threat, coveted by Christians, Muslims, and Jews simultaneously. After the destruction of 70 CE, Jerusalem spent nearly 3 centuries as something of a backwater Roman town called Aelia Capitolina. The Romans had essentially tried to rebrand the city, kind of like how a company might change its name after a major scandal. Jerusalem? Never heard of it. This is Aelia Capitolina. Totally different place. The strategy worked about as well as you'd expect when dealing with people who considered this land divinely promised. Everything changed in the early 4th century when Emperor Constantine decided to become Christianity's biggest fan. In 326 CE, his mother Helena embarked on what might be history's most influential religious tourism trip. Helena visited the Holy Land and began identifying biblical sites with the enthusiasm of someone planning the world's most elaborate theme park. This is where Jesus was born, this is where he died, and this rocky outcrop over here, definitely where he prayed that one time. The most significant of Helena's projects was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over what tradition held to be the site of Jesus' burial. The Romans had conveniently placed a temple of Aphrodite there earlier, which Christians saw as either cosmic irony or divine planning, depending on your theological perspective. The church became Christianity's ultimate pilgrimage destination, turning Jerusalem from a forgotten provincial town into the spiritual capital of the expanding Christian world. Under Byzantine rule, Palestine was reorganized into 3 provinces. Palestina Prima included Judea and Samaria, Palestina Secunda covered Galilee and the Golan Heights, and Palestina Tertia included the southern desert regions. It was an administrative arrangement that made sense, assuming you enjoyed governing territories that everyone else also wanted to govern. The transformation was dramatic. What had been predominantly pagan and Jewish gradually became majority Christian by the late 5th century. The landscape filled with churches, monasteries, and pilgrimage sites. Christian pilgrims arrived from across the empire, bringing spiritual fervour and tourist money, much like modern pilgrimage tourism, but with more donkeys and fewer gift shops. The Jewish community maintained its presence despite various restrictions, though several Samaritan revolts during the 5th and 6th centuries were suppressed, contributing to the near extinction of the Samaritan community. Byzantine Palestine reached its peak population around the mid-6th century with an estimated 1 million inhabitants, built on olive oil production, pilgrimage money, and imperial investment. This Byzantine Golden Age, however, was about to face its greatest challenge. In 614 CE, the Sasanian Persians, led by Khosrow II, launched a devastating invasion of Byzantine territory. Persian forces captured Jerusalem and, according to contemporary sources, massacred much of the Christian population. They also carried off the True Cross, a relic that Helena had allegedly discovered and that had become one of Christianity's most prized possessions. It was the equivalent of stealing the crown jewels, except these jewels were believed to guarantee eternal salvation. The role of the Jewish population during the Persian conquest remains historically controversial. Later, Christian sources accused Jews of collaborating with the invaders and participating in the destruction of churches. Modern historians approach these claims with skepticism, noting that such accusations were common in medieval warfare and often reflected religious prejudice rather than historical fact. What's clearer is that Jewish hopes for a restoration of their position in Jerusalem were quickly disappointed when the Persians apparently decided that appeasing the much larger Christian population was more practical. Byzantine Emperor Heraclius managed to reconquer Palestine in 628 CE and dramatically restored the True Cross to Jerusalem in 629. The ceremony was a major imperial spectacle, with Christians weeping tears of joy at what they saw as a divine miracle. Heraclius's triumph seemed complete, but it would prove to be remarkably short-lived. Sometimes in history, victory parades happen at exactly the wrong moment. While the Byzantines and Persians exhausted themselves in warfare, a new power was emerging in the Arabian Peninsula. In 632 CE, the death of the Prophet Muhammad set in motion events that would transform the entire Middle East. Under the first caliph, Abu Bakr, and then under his successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Arab Muslim armies began expanding beyond Arabia with remarkable speed and efficiency. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE, where Arab forces defeated a major Byzantine army. This victory opened the path to Jerusalem, which Arab forces reached later that year. The siege began under the command of Abu Ubaidah, but the Christian Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, refused to surrender except to the Caliph himself. It was like insisting on speaking to the manager, except the manager controlled half the Arabian Peninsula and several rapidly expanding armies. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab's arrival in Jerusalem in 637 or 638 CE became one of history's most famous examples of diplomatic theatre. According to both Christian and Muslim sources, the Caliph arrived dressed in simple robes, accompanied only by a servant and a donkey. Patriarch Sophronius, expecting the usual imperial pomp, was reportedly amazed to find the leader of the Muslim world indistinguishable from his attendant. It was the 7th century equivalent of a CEO showing up to an important meeting in jeans and flip-flops. The most famous moment of Umar's visit came when Sophronius invited him to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Umar declined, explaining that if he prayed there, future Muslims would claim it as a mosque and the Christians would lose one of their holiest sites. Instead, he prayed on the steps outside the church, where a small mosque was later built in his honour. It was an act of remarkable religious sensitivity that established a precedent for Muslim-Christian relations in the city. The treaty that Umar signed with Sophronius, known as the Pact of Umar, became a model for Islamic governance of non-Muslim populations. Christians and Jews were allowed to maintain their religious practices and communities in exchange for paying the jizya, a special tax for non-Muslims. They could not build new religious structures without permission, but existing churches and synagogues were protected. For its time, this was a relatively tolerant arrangement, certainly more generous than what Muslims might expect in Christian territories, or what Jews had experienced under either Christian or Muslim rule elsewhere. One of the most significant changes came when Umar asked to see the site of Solomon's temple. The Temple Mount had been deliberately left in ruins by the Christians, who saw the destruction as fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy about the temple's fate. Muslims, however, venerated the site as the location of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension to heaven, an event known as the Isra and Miraj. The Temple Mount, called Al-Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary in Arabic, would soon become one of Islam's holiest sites. Under early Muslim rule, Jerusalem flourished again. The Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik commissioned the construction of the magnificent Dome of the Rock in the late 7th century, completed around 691 CE. This architectural masterpiece, with its golden dome and intricate mosaics, was built directly over the foundation stone where the Jewish temple had once stood. The 10th century historian al-Muqaddasi wrote that Abd al-Malik built the shrine to compete in grandeur with Jerusalem's monumental churches. The Dome of the Rock was followed by the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built at the southern end of the Temple Mount. Together, these structures transformed the ancient Jewish holy site into one of Islam's most important religious complexes. It was urban renewal on a cosmic scale, taking a site that had been sacred to one faith and making it central to another, while somehow managing not to completely alienate the original owners. For the next 4 centuries, Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, passing from the Umayyad Caliphate to the Abbasids, and eventually to the Fatimids. The city generally prospered, though it never achieved the political importance of Damascus, Baghdad, or Cairo. Christian pilgrimage continued, and Jewish communities were allowed to return to the city for the first time since the Roman expulsion. It was a period of relative religious pluralism, though one punctuated by occasional tensions and the whims of individual rulers. The most notorious example came under the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who ruled from 996 to 1021 CE. Al-Hakim was, by most accounts, deeply eccentric and increasingly hostile to non-Muslims. In 1009 CE, he ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was severely damaged, though not completely destroyed. The order shocked both Christians and Muslims, and later Fatimid rulers allowed the church to be rebuilt with Byzantine financial assistance. These events in Jerusalem were closely watched in Europe, where stories of Muslim persecution of Christian pilgrims circulated widely. Whether these stories were accurate or exaggerated matters less than their impact on European Christian opinion. The idea of the Holy Land under Muslim control became increasingly problematic for Western Christians, setting the stage for what would become one of the most dramatic chapters in medieval history. The spark came in 1095 CE when Pope Urban II received a request for military assistance from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. At the Council of Clermont, Urban delivered a speech that launched the First Crusade, calling on Christian knights to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land. He promised spiritual rewards, including full remission of sins, to those who answered the call. It was the medieval equivalent of a mobilization for total war. except the war was supposedly being fought for the salvation of souls. The response was extraordinary. Across Western Europe, nobles and peasants alike took the cross and began preparing for the journey to Jerusalem. The First Crusade was actually two separate movements: the People's Crusade, led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, which ended in disaster in Anatolia, and the Prince's Crusade, led by major nobles like Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Godfrey of Bouillon. After 3 years of fighting across Anatolia and Syria, the Crusader army finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099. The city was now under Fatimid control, having been recaptured from the Seljuk Turks just the year before. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had prepared for siege by poisoning wells, removing livestock, and expelling all Christians from the city as potential collaborators. The siege began on the 7th of June and lasted 5 weeks. The Crusaders, reduced to perhaps 1,200 cavalry and 12,000 foot soldiers, faced formidable challenges. They lacked supplies and siege equipment, and the summer heat was brutal. Timber was scarce until Italian sailors dismantled their ships to provide wood. The decisive assault came on the 15th of July, 1099. Crusader forces managed to scale the northern wall using siege towers, with Godfrey of Bouillon leading the charge. Once they gained a foothold, the city's defences collapsed rapidly. What followed was one of medieval warfare's most notorious massacres, with Crusader forces killing thousands of Muslim and Jewish civilians. Godfrey of Bouillon refused to be crowned king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, taking instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The Crusader victory at Ascalon in August defeated a Fatimid relief army and secured Christian control. Thus ended the first great medieval period, with the land passing from Byzantine Christian control to Islamic rule and finally to Western Christian conquest. Jerusalem had truly become the crossroads of medieval civilization, where Europe, Asia, and Africa met geographically, culturally, and religiously. Chapter 3: Ottoman Era to British Mandate. The newly established Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem faced the same problem that would plague every occupying power in this region for centuries to come. How do you govern a land that 3 major religions consider their spiritual homeland, when your own claim rests primarily on the business end of a sword? The Crusaders' solution was straightforward but ultimately unsustainable. They would rule as a Christian military elite over a predominantly Muslim population, with Jewish communities maintaining their presence in the margins. For nearly a century, this arrangement actually worked reasonably well. The Kingdom of Jerusalem developed sophisticated legal codes, built impressive castles, and established trade relationships that brought prosperity to the coastal cities. The Crusader states controlled a thin strip of territory along the Mediterranean coast, with their inland holdings centered on key fortresses that controlled mountain passes and trade routes. It was like a medieval version of a gated community, except the gates were massive stone fortifications and the homeowners association had a tendency to go on armed pilgrimages. But this Christian kingdom had an expiration date, and his name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to history as Saladin. Born into a Kurdish family in the service of Nur al-Din, the ruler of Damascus, Saladin rose to become vizier of Egypt in 1169. Over the following decades, he methodically unified the Muslim territories surrounding the Crusader states under his control, creating exactly the kind of strategic nightmare scenario that Crusader military planners had spent decades trying to prevent. The final crisis began with the kind of diplomatic incident that seems almost designed to trigger a medieval war. In 1187, Reynald of Châtillon one of the most aggressive Crusader lords, raided a Muslim caravan while a truce with Saladin was still in effect. This wasn't just highway robbery, it was a violation of sacred hospitality laws that transcended religious boundaries. Saladin swore that he would personally kill Reynold, which in the context of medieval diplomacy was roughly equivalent to filing a very strongly worded formal complaint. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, near the Sea of Galilee. King Guy of Lusignan marched the entire military force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, approximately 20,000 men, including the kingdom's most elite knights, into what can only be described as a tactical disaster. Saladin had positioned his forces to cut off the Crusaders from water sources during the brutal summer heat, then subjected them to constant harassment from mounted archers. The battle itself was a masterclass in medieval warfare psychology. Saladin's forces lit brushfires to create smoke and confusion, while his archers kept up a constant rain of arrows that gradually wore down the Christian heavy cavalry. When the Crusaders finally tried to break through to reach water, they found themselves trapped on the twin hills called the Horns of Hattin, surrounded by an enemy that had every advantage of position, supply, and morale. The defeat was catastrophic. Most of the kingdom's military leadership was either killed or captured, including King Guy himself. Saladin personally fulfilled his vow by executing Reynold of Chatillon, though he spared most other prisoners according to the customs of medieval warfare. The captured True Cross, which the Crusaders had carried into battle as their most sacred relic, disappeared into Islamic hands and was never recovered. With the Crusader field army eliminated, Saladin's forces swept across the defenseless kingdom like a medieval blitzkrieg. City after city surrendered with minimal resistance. There simply weren't enough soldiers left to defend them. The siege of Jerusalem began on September 20th, 1187, and lasted less than 2 weeks. In stark contrast to the massacre that had accompanied the Crusader conquest in 1099, Saladin allowed the Christian population to leave safely upon payment of a modest ransom. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves across Europe and prompted the Third Crusade, led by 3 of medieval Europe's most famous rulers, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. This crusade managed to recapture much of the Palestinian coast and re-establish a rump Crusader kingdom with its capital at Acre, but Jerusalem itself remained in Muslim hands. The subsequent 2 centuries saw a gradual but inexorable decline of Crusader power. The Fourth Crusade got distracted and sacked Constantinople instead of fighting Muslims. The Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Crusades achieved limited and temporary successes at best. The most surreal moment came in 1229, when Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, negotiated the peaceful return of Jerusalem to Christian control while he was excommunicated by the Pope. It was like winning the lottery while serving a prison sentence. But even this diplomatic triumph proved temporary. In 1244, Jerusalem was captured by Khwarezmian forces allied with the Ayyubids, who massacred the Christian population and destroyed churches with a thoroughness that shocked even contemporary observers. The response was the Seventh Crusade under Louis IX of France, which achieved the remarkable feat of getting the King of France captured in Egypt, demonstrating that even royal participation couldn't guarantee crusading success. The final blow came in 1260, when the Mamluk Sultanate emerged in Egypt. The Mamluks, originally slave soldiers who had seized power from the Ayyubids, proved to be exceptionally effective military organizers. Under leaders like Baibars and Kalawun, they systematically conquered the remaining Crusader strongholds. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader states, nearly 2 centuries after their establishment. The Mamluks ruled Palestine as part of their greater Syrian province, administering it from Cairo through a network of provincial governors. Unlike previous Muslim dynasties, they pursued a deliberate policy of coastal destruction, systematically dismantling ports and harbours to prevent future Crusader invasions from the sea. It was a scorched earth approach to homeland security that left much of the Palestinian coast sparsely populated for centuries. Jerusalem, however, flourished under Mamluk rule. The sultans invested heavily in religious architecture, building 90 structures that survived from the 13th to 15th centuries. Schools, hostels for pilgrims, and renovated mosques transformed the city into a major centre of Islamic learning and pilgrimage. The Temple Mount received particular attention, with new gates, fountains, and administrative buildings that emphasized its status as Al-Haram, Al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Jewish communities also experienced a gradual revival during the later Mamluk period. The famous Spanish rabbi Nachmanides visited Jerusalem in 1267 and established what became the city's second oldest active synagogue. Small groups of Jewish refugees from European persecution found sanctuary in Palestine, though the communities remained small and economically marginal compared to the larger Jewish centres in Spain and Eastern Europe. By the early 16th century, however, the Mamluk Sultanate was facing existential threats from multiple directions. The Portuguese discovery of sea routes to India had undermined the traditional spice trade that formed the backbone of the Egyptian economy. More immediately dangerous, the rising Ottoman Empire had been systematically conquering former Byzantine and Islamic territories, building a formidable military machine based on gunpowder weapons and professional infantry. The end came swiftly. In 1516, Ottoman Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim, invaded Mamluk territory with a military force that represented the cutting edge of early modern warfare. The decisive Battle of Marj Dabik, fought north of Aleppo on August 24, 1516, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Ottoman artillery and firearms against traditional Mamluk cavalry. Sultan Qansu al-Ghawri, the last independent Mamluk ruler, died during the battle, possibly of apoplexy brought on by witnessing his army's destruction. The Mamluk forces, despite their reputation as elite warriors, simply had no answer to coordinated volleys from Ottoman janissaries protected by wagon fortifications. Syria and Palestine fell to the Ottomans almost without further resistance. Selim. I entered Jerusalem on December 29, 1516, marking the beginning of 4 centuries of Ottoman rule that would prove to be the longest period of political stability in the region's recorded history. The transition was remarkably peaceful. No massacres, no forced conversions, no wholesale replacement of local administrators. The Ottomans were experienced empire builders who understood that successful conquest required administrative continuity. Under Selim's son, Suleiman the Magnificent, Palestine experienced a remarkable renaissance. Suleiman commissioned the rebuilding of Jerusalem's city walls, a massive construction project completed around 1540 that created the old city's current architectural footprint. These weren't just defensive fortifications, they were a statement of Ottoman commitment to the permanent governance and protection of the Holy Land. Suleiman also invested heavily in Jerusalem's Islamic infrastructure. The Dome of the Rock received new decorative elements, public fountains were built throughout the city, and the ancient aqueduct system was restored. Most symbolically, he placed an inscription at the Jaffa Gate, declaring, "There is no God but Allah, and Abraham is his friend," a statement designed to unite all 3 Abrahamic faiths under Ottoman protection. The Ottoman administrative system divided Palestine into 3 districts: Jerusalem, Gaza, and Nablus, all connected to the larger Damascus province. This arrangement reflected both practical governance needs and the region's religious significance. Jerusalem received special autonomous status in recognition of its importance to multiple religious communities, while the coastal districts focused on trade and agriculture. For the diverse religious communities of Palestine, Ottoman rule represented a dramatic improvement over the sectarian conflicts of the Crusader period. Christians, Jews, and different Muslim groups were organized into the millet system, which granted considerable autonomy in religious and communal affairs, while requiring loyalty to the Ottoman state and payment of appropriate taxes. Jewish communities, in particular, experienced a remarkable revival. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 had created a diaspora of Sephardic refugees, many of whom found sanctuary in Ottoman territories. Palestine attracted scholars, mystics, and merchants who established new centers of Jewish learning in Jerusalem, Safed, Hebron, and Tiberias. The Ottomans actively encouraged this immigration, recognizing that Jewish commercial networks could enhance the empire's economic prosperity. Christian communities also benefited from Ottoman tolerance, though not without occasional friction. The various Eastern Christian churches, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Coptic, and others, were allowed to maintain their traditions and properties. Western Christians faced more restrictions, but even the Latin Catholics were permitted to maintain a presence at Christianity's holiest sites. This was the world that European travellers and pilgrims encountered when they visited Ottoman Palestine, a land where ancient religious rivalries were held in check by effective imperial administration, where trade routes brought prosperity to coastal cities, and where Jerusalem functioned as a genuinely multicultural holy city. It wasn't perfect. No medieval society was, but it represented a degree of religious tolerance and political stability that the region had rarely experienced. The early Ottoman period also witnessed remarkable economic development. Agricultural production increased as the empire's efficient tax system provided incentives for cultivation. Olive oil, soap, cotton, and wheat became major exports, while Jerusalem pottery flourished under imperial patronage. Pilgrimage tourism brought steady revenue as Christians, Muslims, and Jews arrived from across the Mediterranean world. The 16th and 17th centuries saw significant population growth as refugees from European persecution continued to arrive. Spanish and Portuguese Jewish refugees were joined by Italians fleeing papal restrictions, Greek Christians escaping Venetian rule, and various Muslim populations relocating within the expanding Ottoman realm. Cultural life flourished under this arrangement. Jerusalem became home to renowned scholars, poets, and theologians representing all three Abrahamic traditions. The famous Ottoman travel writer Evliya Çelebi described 17th century Jerusalem as a city of extraordinary learning and devotion, where public debates between scholars of different faiths were common and generally peaceful. However, by the 18th century, signs of imperial decline were becoming apparent. Central control weakened as provincial governors gained more autonomy, sometimes becoming effectively independent rulers. In northern Palestine, Zahir al-Umar established an autonomous principality centered in Acre, demonstrating both local initiative and imperial weakness. His successor, Ahmad Pasha al-Jazar, successfully repelled Napoleon's invasion in 1801 but ruled with an independence that would have been unthinkable during Suleiman's reign. The system endured for 4 centuries, surviving wars, rebellions, natural disasters, and gradual imperial decline. But by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was increasingly known as the sick man of Europe, struggling with military defeats, economic challenges, and rising nationalist movements. The stage was being set for the final transformation of Palestine from an Ottoman province into the contested homeland that would dominate the region's history for the next century and beyond. Chapter 4: Birth of a Nation. The 19th century arrived in Palestine like an unwelcome dinner guest, full of promises about modernization and progress, but with a tendency to rearrange the furniture and leave everyone wondering where their comfortable old arrangements had gone. By the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was experiencing what historians politely call institutional challenges, and what everyone else recognized as a slow-motion collapse of a system that had worked brilliantly for centuries but was now about as effective as a sundial in a thunderstorm. The problems were manifold and interconnected. European powers had gained technological and military advantages that made Ottoman forces look like they were fighting with medieval weaponry, which in some cases they literally were. The empire's financial situation was precarious, with foreign debt mounting and traditional revenue sources proving inadequate for modern administrative needs. Most critically for our story, the rise of nationalism was creating new forms of political organization that challenged the empire's traditional millet system of religious-based autonomous communities. Into this environment of imperial decline came two separate but ultimately interrelated movements that would transform Palestine beyond recognition. The first was Zionism, a Jewish nationalist movement that emerged in late 19th century Europe in response to persistent anti-Semitism and the failure of emancipation to solve what Theodor Herzl called the Jewish question. The second was Arab nationalism, which developed as Ottoman Arab intellectuals began to envision political organization based on language and culture rather than religious affiliation and imperial loyalty. Theodor Herzl, a Hungarian Jewish journalist covering the Dreyfus affair in France, published Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, in 1896, arguing that Jews constituted a nation that deserved a state like any other European people. At the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, delegates declared that Zionism aimed to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. Herzl privately wrote in his diary that he had founded the Jewish state at Basel, though he diplomatically kept this observation to himself in public. Meanwhile, the first Aliyah, or wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine, had begun in 1881, driven primarily by pogroms in the Russian Empire. These early immigrants, numbering perhaps 35,000, established agricultural settlements and began purchasing land from Ottoman Arab landowners. By World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine had grown to about 60,000, or roughly 8% of the total population. It was a significant change, but hardly the demographic revolution that would come later. Arab intellectuals, meanwhile, were developing their own responses to Ottoman decline and European pressure. Writers and political thinkers in Damascus, Beirut, and Cairo began articulating visions of Arab political unity that transcended the traditional divisions between different Ottoman provinces. Palestinian Arabs, who had long identified primarily with their local communities and the broader Ottoman Muslim community, gradually began developing a specifically Palestinian identity in response to both Zionist settlement and the challenges of modernization. World War I arrived in 1914 like a tornado in a library, scattering the careful arrangements of decades and creating opportunities for dramatic political change that no one could have foreseen. The Ottoman Empire, fatefully, chose to ally with Germany and Austria-Hungary, automatically making it an enemy of Britain, France, and Russia. For Palestinian Arabs and Jews alike, this meant their homeland would become a battlefield where empires fought for control of the Middle East. British war planners, desperate for allies against the Ottoman Empire, began making promises to various groups that would prove mutually contradictory and historically explosive. In 1915 and 16, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, exchanged letters with Hussein ibn Ali, the Emir of Mecca, promising British support for Arab independence in exchange for an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. These promises were deliberately vague about boundaries, but Arabs reasonably interpreted them as including Palestine. Simultaneously, British and French diplomats were secretly negotiating the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which divided the Ottoman Arab territories into British and French spheres of influence, with Palestine designated for international administration. It was the kind of diplomatic double-dealing that made Machiavelli look like an amateur, and it would create resentments that persist to this day. But the most famous of these wartime commitments was the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917. In a carefully worded letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, the British government declared its support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while adding that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The declaration was just 67 words long, but it packed more historical dynamite into a single paragraph than most documents manage in volumes. The phrase national home was deliberately ambiguous. It could mean anything from cultural autonomy to full statehood. The promise to protect the rights of non-Jewish communities avoided mentioning that these communities constituted roughly 90% of Palestine's population. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that said everything and nothing simultaneously. British motives for issuing the declaration were complex and pragmatic. They hoped to gain Jewish support for the war effort, particularly from Jewish communities in Russia and the United States. They wanted to prevent Germany from making a similar declaration to gain Jewish sympathy. And they believed that a Jewish Palestine would serve British imperial interests in the post-war Middle East, providing a loyal client state near the Suez Canal. Whether they fully understood the long-term implications is doubtful, but then again, most of Europe's leaders in 1917 were making decisions that would reshape the world in ways no one could foresee. British forces under General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem in December 1917, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. Allenby's entry into the Holy City was carefully staged for maximum symbolic impact. He walked through the Jaffa Gate on foot rather than riding in triumph, showing respect for the city's religious significance to multiple faiths. It was good theatre and even better diplomacy, though it couldn't disguise the fact that Palestine had once again changed imperial masters. The post-war settlement created the British Mandate for Palestine, formally approved by the League of Nations in 1922. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration into international law, charging Britain with facilitating the establishment of a Jewish national home while safeguarding the rights of all Palestinian inhabitants. It was like being asked to organise a dinner party for guests who fundamentally disagreed about what should be on the menu, where the party should be held, and whether the other guests should be allowed to attend. Sir Herbert Samuel, an avowed Zionist, became Palestine's first High Commissioner in 1920. His appointment sent a clear signal about British intentions, though Samuel himself tried to pursue balanced policies that would satisfy both communities. In August 1920, his administration passed the first immigration ordinance, formally opening Palestine to Jewish immigration under official oversight. The 1920s and 30s witnessed successive waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Second Aliyah, 1904 to 1914, had brought idealistic young socialists who established kibbutzim and created the foundations of Hebrew culture in Palestine. The Third Aliyah, 1919 to 1923, brought refugees from Eastern European pogroms. The Fourth Aliyah, 1924 to 1928, consisted largely of middle-class Polish Jews fleeing economic difficulties. But it was the fifth Aliyah, 1929 to 1939, that transformed Palestine's demographics most dramatically. Driven by the rise of Nazism in Germany and increasing persecution across Europe, roughly 250,000 Jewish immigrants arrived in Palestine during this decade. By 1939, Jews constituted nearly 30% of Palestine's population, concentrated primarily in urban areas and the coastal plain. This rapid demographic change inevitably created tensions. Jewish immigrants brought capital, modern agricultural techniques, and European educational systems. They established cities like Tel Aviv, which grew from a suburb of Jaffa into Palestine's largest city. They created economic institutions, including the Histadrut Labour Federation and the Jewish National Fund for Land Purchase. Most significantly, they developed parallel political and military institutions that functioned as a state within a state under the British Mandate. Palestinian Arabs, meanwhile, found themselves marginalised in their own homeland. Land sales to Jewish organisations, while legal under Ottoman and British law, often resulted in the displacement of Arab peasant farmers who had worked the same land for generations. Jewish employment practices favoured Jewish workers, creating separate economic spheres that limited Arab participation in the modernising sectors of the economy. British administrative practices, while formally even-handed, in practice often favoured the better organised and more politically connected Jewish community. Arab opposition crystallised around figures like Hajj Amin al-Husseini, whom the British appointed as Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Al-Husseini combined religious authority with uncompromising political positions and inflammatory rhetoric. His appointment was like putting gasoline in charge of fire safety. Violent clashes erupted periodically throughout the Mandate period. The Western Wall riots of 1929 began with disputes over Jewish prayer rights and escalated into communal violence that left over 200 dead. The most serious outbreak was the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which began as a general strike but evolved into guerrilla warfare requiring substantial British military resources to suppress. As war clouds gathered over Europe in the late 1930s, British policymakers found themselves trapped between contradictory commitments and changing strategic priorities. The 1939 White Paper attempted to limit Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years, with further immigration requiring Arab consent. It promised Palestinian independence within 10 years and placed severe restrictions on Jewish land purchases. The policy satisfied nobody. Arabs rejected it as too little too late, while Zionists condemned it as a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration. World War II transformed the situation completely. The Holocaust made the establishment of a Jewish state seem not just desirable to many, but morally imperative. Jewish military organizations in Palestine cooperated with the British war effort while simultaneously preparing for post-war independence. David Ben-Gurion, chairman of the Jewish Agency, famously declared that Jews would fight the war as if there were no white paper, and fight the white paper as if there were no war. By 1947, Britain had concluded that the mandate was unworkable. Economic exhaustion from the war, growing violence between Jews and Arabs, and international pressure made continued British rule untenable. In February 1947, Britain announced its intention to transfer the Palestine question to the United Nations, effectively admitting that 30 years of attempting to square the circle had failed. The UN Special Committee on Palestine recommended partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly approved Resolution 181, the Partition Plan, by a vote of 33 to 13, with 10 abstentions. The plan allocated roughly 55% of Palestine to the proposed Jewish state, despite Jews constituting only about 33% of the population. Arab leaders rejected the partition plan entirely, arguing that it violated Palestinian rights and rewarded Zionist immigration at the expense of the indigenous population. Jewish leaders accepted the plan publicly while privately preparing for the war they knew was coming. Ben-Gurion reportedly told his colleagues that the partition borders were just a starting point. The new state would expand through war if necessary. Violence erupted immediately after the UN vote. What began as intercommunal clashes escalated into full-scale civil war as British authority collapsed in the final months of the mandate. Jewish forces, better organised and equipped, gradually gained the upper hand, capturing mixed cities like Haifa and Jaffa and securing control of the territory allocated to the Jewish state by the partition plan. On May 14, 1948, with the British mandate set to expire at midnight, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel at a ceremony in Tel Aviv. The declaration was broadcast on radio and immediately recognized by the United States and Soviet Union, giving the new state crucial international legitimacy. Ben-Gurion became Israel's first prime minister, fulfilling Herzl's prediction from 51 years earlier that he had founded the Jewish state at Basel. The next day, armies from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon and Iraq invaded the former Mandate territory, beginning what Israelis call the War of Independence and Arabs call the Nakba, or catastrophe. The war that followed would reshape the Middle East and create the fundamental dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict that persists today. Thus ended the Mandate period and began the State of Israel, born from the intersection of European anti-Semitism, Arab nationalism, British imperial calculations, Holocaust trauma, and UN diplomacy. It was a birth attended by violence and marked by competing claims to the same small piece of land that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many previous civilizations. The stage was now set for the modern chapter of this ancient story. Chapter 5. Modern Development. The dawn of May 15th, 1948, arrived in Palestine with the kind of historical drama that screenwriters spend years trying to create, but rarely achieve. As the last British administrators packed their files and boarded ships at Haifa port, the armies of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon and Iraq began crossing the borders of what had, until midnight, been mandatory Palestine. It was the moment of truth for David Ben-Gurion's day-old State of Israel, a test that would determine whether his bold declaration in Tel Aviv would prove to be the birth certificate of a nation or simply an optimistic piece of paper. The Arab invasion was both inevitable and, paradoxically, half-hearted. Arab leaders had painted themselves into a rhetorical corner with years of promises to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state, but their military preparations revealed the gap between public declarations and private calculations. The Egyptian army that crossed into Gaza was described by its own officers as a punitive expedition against Zionist gangs, rather than a serious attempt at conquest. Jordan's King Abdullah had already reached a secret understanding with Jewish leaders about dividing Palestine between them. Lebanon's army barely participated, having been bought off with financial bribes from Ben-Gurion. It was like watching a prize fight, where half the challengers were secretly hoping the other guy would win. For all that, the war that followed was deadly serious for those who fought it. Israeli military intelligence estimated the country's chances of survival at roughly 50-50, which in the context of recent Jewish history was not particularly encouraging odds. The Israel Defense Forces, hastily organized from the pre-state Haganah militia and reinforced by Holocaust survivors with military experience, faced Arab armies equipped with British weapons and led by British-trained officers. The early weeks were touch and go. Egyptian forces surrounded Jewish settlements in the Negev and threatened Tel Aviv. The Arab Legion, Jordan's professional army, captured the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's old city after fierce fighting, destroying synagogues and expelling the surviving residents. Syrian and Lebanese forces made limited advances in the north. For a few weeks it genuinely appeared that the nascent Israeli state might be strangled in its cradle. But Israel had several crucial advantages that became apparent as the fighting continued. Jewish forces ultimately outnumbered the Arab armies 2-1, despite being perceived as David facing Goliath. More importantly, they were fighting for their literal survival on their own territory, while Arab armies were operating far from their bases with uncertain political support at home. The Israelis also benefited from superior organization, better communication systems, and remarkably, a more unified command structure than their opponents. The turning point came during the first truce in June 1948. While UN mediators attempted to broker peace, both sides used the ceasefire to rearm and reorganize. Israel benefited far more from this pause, receiving crucial weapons shipments from Czechoslovakia and integrating thousands of new immigrants into its military forces. When fighting resumed, Israeli forces had transformed from a desperate militia into an effective army. The second phase of the war saw systematic Israeli victories. Operation Dani captured the strategic towns of Lydda and Ramla, securing the road to Jerusalem. Operation Hiram cleared Arab forces from northern Galilee. Operation Yoav broke the Egyptian siege of the Negev settlements. By early 1949, Israeli forces were advancing toward the Egyptian border and threatening Damascus, while Arab armies were in full retreat. The war officially ended with a series of armistice agreements negotiated by UN mediator Ralph Bunche, whose diplomatic skills earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. Between February and July 1949, Israel signed separate armistices with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Iraq simply withdrew its forces without signing anything, since it shared no border with Israel anyway. The armistice lines, marked in green ink on the maps and therefore called the Green Line, became Israel's de facto borders. These boundaries gave Israel control of 78% of mandatory Palestine, significantly more than the 56% allocated by the UN partition plan. Egypt retained control of the Gaza Strip, while Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. No Palestinian state emerged from the wreckage of the Mandate, as the Palestinians found themselves divided between Israeli, Egyptian, and Jordanian rule. The human cost of the war was devastating. Israel lost over 6,000 people, roughly 1% of its population, including many Holocaust survivors who had barely escaped one catastrophe, only to die in another. Arab casualties were probably higher, though exact figures remain disputed. Most tragically, over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting, creating a refugee crisis that persists to this day. Palestinians call these events the Nakba, or catastrophe, and their interpretation of the war differs fundamentally from the Israeli narrative. Where Israelis see a defensive struggle for survival, Palestinians see a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing designed to create a Jewish majority state. Both narratives contain elements of truth, and both continue to shape the conflict decades later. For Israel, victory in the 1948 war was transformative. The new state had not only survived but proved its military capabilities against overwhelming odds. The War of Independence, as Israelis called it, became a foundational myth of Israeli identity, celebrating the triumph of the few against the many. More practically, the expanded territory provided the strategic depth that Israeli planners believed necessary for the country's long-term security. But victory also brought unexpected challenges. Israel now controlled nearly 1 million Palestinian Arab refugees and internally displaced persons, most of whom were hostile to the new state. The decision to prevent refugee return, while understandable from a security perspective, created a permanent source of regional instability. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from Arab countries began arriving in Israel, requiring massive integration efforts that strained the young state's resources. The next 2 decades saw Israel's gradual development from an embattled startup state into a regional power. David Ben-Gurion focused on building institutions, absorbing immigrants, and developing the economy. The Knesset established democratic governance through coalition governments. Hebrew was revived as a living language, and Israeli culture began emerging from its European roots. Israel pursued a mixed economic model combining socialist kibbutzim, private enterprise, and government development projects. The country invested heavily in education, technology, and agriculture, turning desert green through innovative irrigation and transforming from agricultural to industrial society. Foreign aid from the United States and West Germany provided crucial development capital. But the armistice lines established in 1949 proved to be neither permanent borders nor the foundation for lasting peace. Periodic border incidents, economic boycotts, and arms races kept tensions high throughout the 1950s and 60s. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as the champion of Arab nationalism, calling for Israel's destruction while building a powerful military force with Soviet assistance. The crisis that led to the next major war began in the mid-1960s with escalating border tensions, particularly along the Syrian frontier. Palestinian guerrilla attacks launched from Arab territories provoked Israeli reprisals, creating a cycle of violence that gradually spiraled out of control. Soviet intelligence reports, possibly deliberate disinformation, claimed that Israel was massing forces for an attack on Syria. In May 1967, Nasser responded to these reports by mobilizing Egyptian forces, expelling UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula, and closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. The closure of the straits was particularly provocative, as Israel had declared access to the Red Sea through Eilat to be a vital national interest. Jordan's King Hussein, despite private reservations, joined the Egyptian-Syrian alliance, completing what looked like a noose around Israel's borders. Israeli leaders faced an agonizing choice: accept what appeared to be a gradual strangulation of their country's economy and security, or launch a preemptive war against overwhelming odds. The Israeli public, traumatized by memories of the Holocaust, feared another attempt at Jewish genocide. Long lines formed at emigration offices as some Israelis prepared for the worst. On June 5, 1967, Israel chose war. In a perfectly coordinated surprise attack, Israeli aircraft struck Egyptian airfields at the moment when most Egyptian pilots were having breakfast, destroying nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground within 3 hours. Similar attacks crippled the Syrian and Jordanian air forces. With air superiority assured, Israeli ground forces launched simultaneous offensives on 3 fronts. The speed and completeness of Israeli victory in the Six-Day War shocked the world. Egyptian forces in the Sinai collapsed within 3 days. Despite Israeli warnings, Jordan attacked West Jerusalem, provoking a counterattack that captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem within 2 days. Syrian positions in the Golan Heights fell on the final day after fierce fighting. When ceasefire took effect on June 10th, Israel had tripled its territory, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem and Golan Heights. Israeli casualties were remarkably light, while Arab casualties numbered in thousands. Israeli paratroopers praying at the Western Wall became an iconic image, symbolizing Jewish return to their holiest site. The Six-Day War transformed both Israel and the Middle East. For Israelis, lightning victory seemed to confirm divine favor and military invincibility. The capture of Jerusalem's old city fulfilled messianic dreams and complicated Israel's secular identity. Suddenly, Israel controlled all of historic Palestine, plus the Sinai and Golan Heights. But victory also created new dilemmas. Israel now ruled over 1 million Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, most of them refugees from the 1948 war. Should these territories be returned for peace, kept for security, settled by Jewish civilians? The Israeli government was divided, and its indecision created facts on the ground that would shape the conflict for decades. The immediate aftermath saw the establishment of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, beginning with the reconstruction of Jewish communities destroyed in 1948. The settlement movement grew slowly at first, but accelerated after the 1973 war, driven by a combination of security concerns, religious ideology, and government policy. Each new settlement made the question of territorial return more complicated. For Palestinians, the 1967 defeat, called al-Naksa, the setback, marked the end of hopes that Arab armies would liberate Palestine. The remaining 22% of historic Palestine was now under Israeli control, and the dream of return to the homes lost in 1948 seemed more distant than ever. Palestinian nationalism, previously submerged within broader Arab identity, began emerging as a distinct political force. The Palestine Liberation Organization, established in 1964 but previously dominated by Arab governments, gradually came under the control of Palestinian guerrilla groups led by figures like Yasser Arafat. The new Palestinian strategy emphasized armed struggle and international diplomacy rather than reliance on Arab armies. The hijacking of international aircraft, attacks on Israeli civilians, and guerrilla warfare became hallmarks of Palestinian resistance. Israel's victory also changed the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War Middle East. The Soviet Union, humiliated by the defeat of its Arab clients, poured new weapons and advisors into Egypt and Syria. The United States, initially reluctant to become deeply involved in Middle Eastern conflicts, gradually became Israel's primary patron and arms supplier. The Arab-Israeli conflict became a proxy battleground between the superpowers. The celebration of Israeli invincibility ended abruptly on October 6, 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack during Yom Kippur, Judaism's holiest day. The Yom Kippur War, as it became known, caught Israeli forces completely unprepared and inflicted heavy casualties before Israeli counterattacks stabilized the fronts. Though Israel ultimately prevailed, the war shattered the myth of effortless victory and forced a more realistic assessment of the country's position. More importantly, the 1973 war created the conditions for the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, convinced that military means could not recover the Sinai Peninsula, chose the path of negotiation. His dramatic visit to Jerusalem in 1977, followed by the Camp David Accords in 1978, resulted in Egyptian recognition of Israel in exchange for complete Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, signed in 1979, was both historic breakthrough and source of new complications. For the first time, a major Arab state accepted Israel's existence and established normal relations. The Sinai withdrawal, completed in 1982, demonstrated that Israel could trade land for peace when convinced of partners' sincerity. But the peace with Egypt also isolated Israel from the broader Arab world and complicated the Palestinian question. With Egypt neutralized, Israel was freer to act in Lebanon and the occupied territories, but had fewer incentives to address Palestinian aspirations. By the 1980s, Israel had evolved from a small, embattled state into a regional power with nuclear weapons, sophisticated military, and thriving economy. But it also ruled over nearly 2 million Palestinians denied political rights and increasingly organized in resistance to occupation. The stage was set for the next phase, the struggle between Israeli security and Palestinian self-determination that would define the final decades of the 20th century. Chapter 6: Contemporary Israel. The 1980s arrived in Israel with all the confidence of a nation that had survived its founding wars and established itself as the dominant regional power. But confidence, as any therapist will tell you, sometimes masks deeper anxieties. By the middle of the decade, Israel controlled territories containing nearly 2 million Palestinians who had no political rights, no citizenship, and increasingly no patience with a situation that showed no signs of changing. It was a powder keg waiting for someone to light the fuse, and on December 8, 1987, an Israeli truck driver provided the spark. The incident itself was tragically mundane. An Israeli vehicle struck and killed 4 Palestinian workers at the Erez crossing in Gaza. Palestinians believed the crash was deliberate retaliation for the killing of an Israeli merchant in Gaza days earlier. Israelis insisted it was an accident. In the normal course of events, the truth might have been determined through investigation. Statements would have been issued, and the cycle of recrimination would have continued at the usual low simmer. Instead, what happened was the First Intifada. The word intifada means shaking off in Arabic, and that's precisely what began in the Jabalia refugee camp that December evening. Thousands of Palestinians poured into the streets, and when 17-year-old Hatem al-Sisi was shot dead by Israeli soldiers, the uprising spread like wildfire across Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Within weeks, the most comprehensive Palestinian resistance movement since 1948 was in full swing. The First Intifada was remarkable for several reasons, not least because it was almost entirely spontaneous. Unlike previous Palestinian resistance movements, it wasn't organized by the PLO leadership in distant Tunisia, but emerged from the grassroots, refugee camps, villages, and urban neighborhoods where people had lived under occupation for 20 years. The unified national leadership of the uprising emerged only after the protests had begun, attempting to coordinate what was already happening rather than directing it from above. The tactics of the Intifada were deliberately designed to dramatize the David and Goliath nature of the conflict. Palestinian teenagers threw stones at Israeli soldiers armed with rifles and tear gas. Commercial strikes shut down Palestinian businesses. Families refused to pay taxes to Israeli authorities. Underground schools operated when Israel closed Palestinian educational institutions. It was civil disobedience mixed with rock throwing, and it proved remarkably effective at capturing international attention. Israel's response was harsh and, ultimately, counterproductive. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin ordered troops to break bones of Palestinian demonstrators, believing that sufficient physical punishment would end the uprising. Instead, images of Israeli soldiers beating Palestinian children with clubs became nightly news footage around the world. The moral clarity that had sustained Israel's international support since its founding began to erode as television viewers watched a professional army using live ammunition against stone-throwing teenagers. The statistics tell part of the story. By the time the First Intifada ended in 1993, over 1,000 Palestinians had been killed, including 250 children. More than 100,000 Palestinians were injured, mostly from gunshots, beatings, and tear gas inhalation. Approximately 120,000 Palestinians were imprisoned at various times during the six-year uprising. Israeli casualties were much lower, just over 100 soldiers and civilians killed, but the psychological impact on Israeli society was profound. More importantly, the Intifada transformed both Palestinian and Israeli political calculations. For Palestinians, it demonstrated that they could resist occupation without relying on Arab armies that had repeatedly failed them. It also internationalized their cause in ways that decades of PLO diplomacy had not achieved. For Israelis, it shattered the comfortable illusion that they could rule over another people indefinitely without paying a significant price. The uprising also gave rise to Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, which emerged from the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in December 1987. Unlike the secular PLO, Hamas combined Palestinian nationalism with Islamic fundamentalism, offering an alternative vision of resistance that would prove increasingly popular among Palestinians, frustrated with the ineffectiveness of traditional leadership. By the early 1990s, both Israeli and Palestinian leaders were ready for a new approach. The PLO had been weakened by its support for Iraq during the Gulf War, losing crucial Arab financial backing. Israel was exhausted by the Intifada and facing international pressure for a political solution. Most importantly, the end of the Cold War had eliminated the strategic importance of the Arab-Israeli conflict to the superpowers, creating space for new diplomatic initiatives. The breakthrough came not from high-level diplomacy but from an unlikely source: academic conferences in Norway. Beginning in 1992, Israeli academics and PLO officials began meeting informally in Oslo, ostensibly to discuss economic cooperation, but actually exploring the possibilities for political agreement. These back-channel discussions gradually evolved into serious negotiations, mediated by Norwegian Foreign Ministry officials who provided the discretion and persistence that formal diplomacy often lacks. The Oslo process succeeded where previous negotiations had failed because it sidestepped the most difficult issues in favor of gradual confidence-building measures. Rather than attempting to resolve questions of borders, refugees, and Jerusalem immediately, the negotiators agreed on mutual recognition and a framework for Palestinian self-government that would, theoretically, lead to a permanent settlement after a 5-year transition period. On September 13, 1993, the world watched in amazement as Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn. President Bill Clinton, beaming like a proud parent, stood between the former enemies as they signed the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements. It was one of those moments that seemed to prove that even the most intractable conflicts could be resolved through patient diplomacy and good faith. The mutual recognition was historic. The PLO acknowledged Israel's right to exist, giving up claims to 78% of historic Palestine. Israel recognized the PLO as Palestinian representatives, though notably not their right to statehood. Under Oslo, Israel would gradually withdraw from Palestinian areas, allowing the Palestinian Authority to assume civil administration. Final status negotiations were postponed until the interim period built trust. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Arafat returned from exile to establish the Palestinian Authority. Israeli forces withdrew from major Palestinian cities. In 1994, Rabin, Arafat, and Peres shared the Nobel Peace Prize. But Oslo contained the seeds of its own failure. It ignored the massive power imbalance between occupier and occupied. Israeli settlement construction continued throughout the Oslo period, with the settler population growing faster than ever. Each new settlement made Palestinian statehood more difficult, while convincing Palestinians that Israel negotiated in bad faith. The death blow to Oslo came on November 4th, 1995, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist who believed the Prime Minister was betraying Jewish rights to the biblical land of Israel. Hamas suicide bombings in early 1996 turned Israeli opinion against Oslo. Benjamin Netanyahu defeated Peres and became Prime Minister, effectively ending the peace process. He later boasted that he had put an end to the Oslo Accords. In 1999, Ehud Barak defeated Netanyahu, promising to complete Oslo's unfinished business. But the Camp David summit of July 2000 collapsed when Arafat rejected Barak's offer, apparently concluding the proposed Palestinian state would be too fragmented to constitute genuine sovereignty. The failure poisoned relations, with Israelis believing they had no partner for peace, and Palestinians convinced Israel would never end occupation voluntarily. The spark came when Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in September 2000, accompanied by a massive security detail. Palestinians saw it as deliberate provocation. The following day, Israeli police killed several Palestinian protesters, triggering the Second Intifada, far more violent than its predecessor. The Second Intifada lasted until 2005 and was far more destructive. Over 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed. Palestinian suicide bombers struck Israeli cities, while Israeli forces reoccupied Palestinian areas. The violence effectively ended the Israeli peace camp as a political force. Sharon became Prime Minister in 2001, combining military pressure with unilateral measures to separate Israelis and Palestinians permanently. The West Bank separation barrier, begun in 2002, incorporated major settlement blocks while separating Palestinian communities. In 2005, Sharon withdrew from Gaza while expanding West Bank settlements, formaldehyde for the peace process, as his advisor described it. Hamas won Palestinian elections in 2006, splitting Palestinian leadership between Gaza and the West Bank. This division persists today, weakening Palestinian negotiating positions and providing Israel justification for avoiding serious peace negotiations. By the 2010s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had settled into a bitter stalemate. Israel achieved most security objectives through military dominance and physical separation, while Palestinians remained divided between competing authorities. Periodic rounds of violence in Gaza, settlement expansion in the West Bank, and international peace initiatives that went nowhere became the new normal. Multiple American presidents attempted to revive peace negotiations. The Bush administration's roadmap to peace in 2003 went nowhere. Obama's intensive efforts through Secretary of State John Kerry collapsed in 2014 over continued settlement expansion and Palestinian political divisions. The Trump administration's approach effectively abandoned the two-state solution, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and supporting Israeli annexation plans. Meanwhile, Israeli politics moved steadily rightward. Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power in 2009 and became the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, building coalitions with religious and nationalist parties that opposed Palestinian statehood. The Israeli centre-left, once the driving force behind peace negotiations, collapsed as a significant political force. Today, Israel stands as one of the world's most successful economies, with a per capita income approaching that of Western Europe and a technology sector that punches well above its weight. Its military remains the most powerful in the Middle East, equipped with advanced weapons systems and, though never officially acknowledged, nuclear weapons that provide the ultimate guarantee of the country's survival. But 6 decades after its founding, Israel still hasn't resolved the fundamental contradiction that has defined its existence since 1948: how to maintain both its Jewish character and its democratic values while ruling over millions of Palestinians who have no political rights. The two-state solution that once seemed like the obvious answer appears increasingly impossible as settlement expansion continues and Palestinian political institutions remain weak and divided. Some observers now speak of a one-state reality in which Israelis and Palestinians live under a single government between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. But whether such an arrangement would resemble South African apartheid, a democratic binational state, or something else entirely remains unclear. What is certain is that the small strip of land that has witnessed the rise and fall of so many civilizations continues to defy easy solutions to the competing claims of its inhabitants. Israel in the 2020s remains what it has always been, a remarkable success story shadowed by an unresolved moral dilemma. Its achievements in technology, agriculture, and democratic governance are genuinely impressive, but the occupation that began as a temporary security measure in 1967 has become a permanent feature of Israeli rule, creating realities on the ground that make peace increasingly difficult to imagine. Perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion to this ancient land's modern story. For 4 millennia, the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has been a crossroads where civilizations meet, clash, and somehow coexist. Today's Israeli-Palestinian conflict is simply the latest chapter in that long history of competing claims to the same small piece of earth. Whether it will end in tragedy, triumph, or something more complex remains to be written by future generations who will inherit both the promises and the problems of this troubled but enduring land.